This morning's scripture is from Exodus chapter 1. Exodus chapter 1, beginning at verse 8. Now, a new king arose over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase, and in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them, and to oppress them with forced labor. They built cities, Pithom and Ramesses, for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. The Egyptians became ruthless in imposing tasks on the Israelites and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in every kind of field labor. They were ruthless in all the tasks that they imposed on them. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, "When you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, she shall live." But the midwives feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this and allowed the boys to live?" The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them." So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, "Every boy that is born to the Hebrews you shall throw into the Nile, but you shall let every girl live." Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine baby, she hid him for 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and plastered it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds on the bank of the river. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her attendants walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to bring it. When she opened it, she saw the child. He was crying, and she took pity on him. "This must be one of the Hebrews' children," she said. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Yes." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed it. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and she took him as her son. She named him Moses because, she said, "I drew him out of the water." G. Ernest Wright was one of the most prominent and respected Hebrew Bible scholars of the middle of the 20th century. one of his students at Harvard Divinity School was Dean McBride. And Dean McBride was my teacher at Garrett Evangelical Seminary. And in the class I took from Dean McBride, Old Testament Interpretation 1, he told this story on G. Ernest Wright. At one time, even the most prominent and respected Hebrew Bible scholar was a first-year seminary student. And G. Ernest Wright had told this story on himself to his Hebrew Bible students. And then McBride told it on his teacher, to me and the others in our class. The first exam came up in Old Testament 1 at McCormick Seminary. And the format of the exam, which is the format I was used to, may still be the format. It's been 35 years since I took an exam, so it may have changed. But the format of the exam is that the first part of the exam is identifications. You'll see names on the sheet, and you have to write a sentence or two identifying who that is or what that is and its significance. So on this first exam, G. Ernest Wright looked, and question number 1 was Shiphrah and Puah. And he looked. Now he had an option. He could have just skipped it. But instead, he wrote, I don't know. I don't care. And I won't learn. So one of the things you knew, if you were a student of G. Ernest Wright, was that on your first exam, you were going to get an identification question, and it was going to be Shiphrah and Puah. You knew, if you were a student of Dean McBride's, that there was going to be a question on your first Old Testament exam, Shiphrah and Puah. And you could be a boring student like I was. And you could say, Shiphrah and Puah were the Hebrew midwives who refused Pharaoh's order to murder the boy Hebrew children. And that would be right. But you could also get credit for the answer if you wrote, I don't know, I don't care, and I won't learn. Because that meant you had been paying attention in class. Not only had you done the reading, you'd been to class and you paid attention and you knew the story and it was going to stick with you. That's why, all these years later, I know who Shiphrah and Puah are. I still know. I might have forgotten, except for the answer, I don't know, I don't care, and I won't learn. They are characters in a story that is written from below. They are characters in a story that is written from the point of view of the oppressed. We hear about a king. And immediately we know this is not going to go well for the king because he's called king. He's not called Pharaoh. He is a king of Egypt, but he's not called Pharaoh. He's the king. And he doesn't know Joseph. Now, some have figured from other sources, other documents from the era, that a group of invaders from the south have displaced the pharaohs. They've displaced the dynasty that was ruling Egypt during the time of Joseph. It's not just he doesn't remember, it's that his dynasty, his kingship, wasn't even a part of what went on with Joseph. Joseph had saved that dynasty. He had saved the lives of the people of Egypt. There had been a long drought, and the crops had failed. But because of his planning ahead, there was food, and the people survived. The kingship survived. But now it maybe has been maybe as many as 400 years, and that dynasty has fallen, and there's a new dynasty. There's a new king. And the king is nervous. The king is always going to be anxious because he's at the top. Someone asked King George VI, Queen Elizabeth's father, what he thought about being king just after he'd become king. And he said, well, really, it's not such a great job. There's no room for advancement. There's no room for advancement if you're the new king. You can only fall. And he looks around and he sees these allies of the old regime, of the old dynasty, and they make him afraid. And so he says, let's deal shrewdly with them. Let's deal wisely with them. And he does something. He calls it wise. He calls it shrewd. It's foolish. He sets them to hard labor. He's afraid they're getting too strong, so he sets them to hard labor. It would be as if I said, I'm afraid you're going to get too strong for me. I'm going to make you lift weights every day. When you set people to hard labor, they get stronger. They become more of a threat if you're worried about threats. So he treats them as more of a threat. He goes to the midwives. These are women who have studied by tradition and observation how to keep mothers and babies alive through childbirth. Childbirth has been, over the millennia, a hazardous event. Women die in childbirth. Babies die in childbirth. We have cut down on that a lot, but we haven't eliminated the danger. We've just studied more about what interventions to use. These are midwives who have studied the interventions to use to help keep mothers alive and help keep babies alive through childbirth. And his next shrewd idea is to say to these women, to Shiphrah and Puah, you women who have spent your lives, who have had handed down to you the ways to keep people alive, are to become executioners. That's not very shrewd. That's not very wise. They are not going to do it. But they don't say, we won't do it. They are in danger for not doing it, but they're not going to say, we're not doing it. They tease him. he probably doesn't know much about childbirth with Egyptian women. He doesn't want to know, probably. He just wants to know if he's got a healthy baby boy. That's all he's interested in. Does he have a healthy baby boy? And if the wife dies, you know he's got more wives, so he doesn't get that worked up about it, maybe. But he's interested in having a healthy baby boy, and otherwise he doesn't want to know much about childbirth. And so they use that ignorance against him. Oh, you may have heard about how hard it is on Egyptian women. Hebrew women aren't like that. That we're hardly even needed. They tell a lie, but they tell a lie to save lives. They tell a lie to save lives, and the Talmud recognizes to tell a lie to someone with evil intent to save lives is acceptable. So then he says, okay, I'm going to make everybody executioners. And my guess is that there were a lot of folks not interested in being executioners for the king. And this couple has a baby. And the Hebrew says he was good. It's the same word that's used in Genesis 1 when God sees the creation and says it's good. It's very, very good. This baby is good. He's very, very good. Now, I don't know how you keep a newborn from crying for the first 3 months. I've had 2 newborns. That's all they do for the first 3 months. They eat, they sleep, they get rid of what they've eaten, and they cry. That's all they do. Somehow or other, Moses' cries weren't heard. I don't know why they weren't heard, but she's been able to protect him. But now that he's 3 months old, they have another plan. Their plan is to put him in an ark. Again, there's 2 places in the Hebrew Bible where the word is used. An ark. It's used in the story of Noah, where the ark helps preserve humanity and creation. And here, the basket she puts him in is called an ark, to save the new creation, the new thing God's going to do. And she employs his sister. Now, my father was the youngest and the only boy. When he was born, one of his sisters was 15 and the other one was 10. He had 3 moms to look after him. They probably argued about whose turn it was to take care of Mervyn. Little big sisters are going to look after their little brothers. So it's not a burden on his sister to look after him. See what happens. She puts him in the Nile. And now another woman shows up. A woman of privilege. A woman who lives in the palace. She knows what the decrees of her father are. But she hears crying and gets the basket, and her heart is moved with pity. At the depth of her being, she falls in love with this baby. She had some options. She knew the decrees. She could have just turned the ark over. Could have just turned the basket over and let the baby drown. That's what her father would have told her to do. She could have called law enforcement. She could have sent him off to whatever constituted an Egyptian orphanage in those days. She doesn't do any of that. The sister comes up and says, "Would you like me to find a nurse for him?" And she says, yes. She knows who's going to be nursing this baby. She doesn't ask, but she knows. She knows it's going to be his own mother. And she's going to pay Moses' mother to feed her own baby. By now, the folks here in this story around the campfire are laughing at this foolish king and all of these women who have thwarted his plans. The new thing God is doing, the new thing God's going to be doing through this baby comes because women won't do what they're told. Because Shiphrah and Puah, who, don't get another mention in the Bible, don't do what they're told. These women conspire and thwart the plans of the king, who's not so wise or shrewd at all. He's pretty foolish. And they get to have a good laugh at him. And if you make your enemy ridiculous, you've beaten him, which is what these stories do. So I'm glad that I know who Shiphrah and Puah are. I'm glad and have come to care who they are. And it's fun to have learned it and to teach it.